This week, the Facts traveled to Canton to learn more about the growing opposition to Summit Carbon Solutions' proposed CO2 pipeline. The following are excerpts from the presentation made in Canton on December 18th.
So I'm going to keep this short because we're a little behind schedule and I want to get Mark and Steve have a lot here to say, but I do want to recognize Tony Ventura. Tony? Where's Tony? Okay, Tony, for Lincoln County, he has worked so hard. Him and Ernie Stratmeyer, and I know there's others too, Sarah Stevers here and Michelle Jensen and others that I'm sure I'm missing, but Tony specifically has worked really hard trying to get some good ordinances together. There's been others that have worked on those as well. He's worked tirelessly with signs and all of those things. So if you see him afterwards, really thank him because he's really gone to bat for you. Also, are the Pancratses here from Turner County? Dave and Ann? Okay. So our Turner County people too that have been working on this, Dave and Ann Pancratz. If you're from Turner County, you can give them a good firm handshake afterwards and tell them thank you as well. So, governments are instituted among men. Why? For you, for your rights. That is why we have governments. And we, as elected officials, derive our power from the consent of the governed. And so that is what really has frustrated me when I have gone to peer, when I have gone to county commission meetings. It's like we have turned the tables, and instead our elected officials and our state agencies or county agencies are instead telling us what we have to do instead of the other way around. So they really need to hear from you, and you need to remind them of that they are there for you, first and foremost. And so this whole pipeline situation came to me as it was coming through some of our own family ground. Both Navigator and Summit were going to be coming through. I got a letter on my desk before I was elected, and I was like, wow, we had just got done with a big natural gas project, replacing that line from Sioux City to Sioux Falls. We need natural gas. It's for public use. We get it. It was a pain in the butt project, but we got it done. And I got this in the mail, and I'm like, man, I really don't wish to go through that again so soon after this. And so I set it aside, and immediately, too, I thought, this is the Green New Deal. I read that, literally, I still remember reading that letter thinking, this is the Green New Deal. I don't have any interest in participating. I'm setting it over here. Went to one of our county committee meetings on something else, and I saw our state chair there of the Republican Party, and I was like, wow, what are you doing here? And he's like, oh, I'm here representing Summit. So that began the ball rolling of me kind of connecting some dots and saying, this really seems pretty political, even though it's supposed to be, just this project that they're doing to capture CO2. So all of that being said, fast forward, I was elected, I went to peer, and I didn't really think I would be doing, bringing the legislation that I ended up bringing, which was because a bunch of these guys ended up showing up saying, hey, we need some legislation passed for property rights it happens to be with this carbon dioxide pipeline, but all of us started seeing that, hey, this is going to be a domino effect because this is really about property rights. This isn't just about a CO2 pipeline. This is about them coming in and saying, we can do what we want with your property, and this is not even for public use. It is eminent domain for private gain. So this is not a public use, a public company, and besides that, it is for private gain and not for public use. So that's really the stickler, that this is all, it's nothing that you are going to use or I'm going to use or our neighbors or the town north or south of us is going to benefit from. This is all about a pipeline company making a lot of money, and they've had a good sales pitch to the ethanol companies that they've gotten them to sign on to it as well. So just to briefly tell you, we went through the legislature, presented a bill that would have encapsulated that this is basically not for public use, it's not a commodity because they were going to bury it in the ground. It passed the House 40-28. We got over in the Senate, and it failed in the Senate committee 9-0. And we basically knew before it even made it over there that it wasn't going to pass. And so what's really interesting is that almost the exact same thing happened in Iowa with their legislation. So it passed their House. Their Senate didn't even hear it over there. So here we had it pass the House, didn't pass their Senate, and then North Dakota had some similar things happen as well. So we start connecting the dots even further, and we see this is happening in North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa. And, this is a big picture of big company, BlackRock. We have some Chinese investments. We have the United Arab Emirates. We have, a host of foreign investments. We have not only those things, but we have a big safety issue because CO2 is heavier than air. It's an asphyxiant. And if there is a rupture, we could all be in big trouble if you're anywhere near it. We have our land values, that we have Michelle Jensen over here that has property they purchased that since they purchased, and they have some building eligibilities, and since the pipeline's coming through, nobody's interested with her property. We have an insurance issue with the liability that farmers are getting letters. I know I saw somebody here earlier tonight that had recently, just the other day, called me, said, I got a letter from my insurance company saying, hey, we don't cover this. So all of those things, but the biggest one of all is the eminent domain for private game, because that is where it comes in and it hits us, and it really, in my mind, it is unconstitutional. Because if they can do that, they can come to you for a variety of reasons for economic development and say, we need your property for this project because we think we know better than you do what to do with your property. So we're in a fight, we're in a battle, and we're gonna keep marching forward. We need you to show up in Pierre during this session. We're talking about even having a landowner rally there again. And so we're going to try to get that together. We're going to be bringing some legislation. But we really need to hear from you because we have the same Senate this next session that we had last year. They haven't changed. And so the way to move the needle on that is the public. And we need your support, and we just appreciate you being involved, being here tonight. And with that, I'm going to pass it on back to Trent and have him introduce Mark. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Carla.
When I think about what has the power to change the world, it could all be said with just one word: kindness. And what if we lived with a heart of kindness? What if we loved like we've been loved? If that's all that we're remembered for, well, let that be enough. So when they stand and tell the stories of who we are and what we've done, of 1,000 things that we could leave behind us. And what if we lived with a heart of kindness? What if we loved like we've been loved? If that's all that we're remembered for, well, let that word be kindness.
You're watching the South Dakota Channel.
Thank you. Thanks for the welcome. Thanks for the introduction, Trent. I never know how I'm going to start, but when he quoted UC Berkeley, like that's the only guy that can quote UC Berkeley. So this popped into my mind. There was a professor at UC Berkeley. His name was Professor Donald E. Brown, and he wrote a book called Human Universals. And it was about all these things that are common denominators to all humanity since the Garden of Eden. Like we all socialize around food, for example. and we decorate our bodies with something, even if they're in the Amazon. It's the only thing is a decoration. Those things are common denominators, about 120 of them. So I'm reading through this book, Human Universals, Professor Donald E. Brown, UC Berkeley, and there's a footnote down, and I read this footnote, and it says, all civilizations since the dawn of man have always tried to affect the weather. It was about 1:30 in the morning, and I laughed. I burst out laughing. Everybody tries to affect the weather. Every civilization has. So now we're trying to affect the weather in this way by sequestering CO2 when it's a tiny little bit of our atmosphere. And it used to be the rain dance. They sacrificed virgins down there in Central America. We seeded the clouds a generation or two ago. Now we're going to try to set the Earth's thermostat. And what utter arrogance to think that God can't manage that on his own. I could go through the science of what that is built into the atmosphere. That'll take too long to explain that. But I did do this. I drilled into a couple of things. I put my staff to hard work on this because I wanted an answer. What is the total mass of all of the atmosphere that has been attracted to the Earth by gravity? Now, I don't remember that number anymore, but it's quadrillion, so many quadrillion. And then I said, okay, but what is the total mass of the CO2 suspended in the atmosphere since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution by American industry? Both of those numbers are known. So when we figured that out, I said, okay, now draw me a graph. Give me an 8-foot circle that shows all of the atmosphere of the Earth to show us the mass of that. And now draw a circle in the middle of it that shows me how much CO2 we put up in the atmosphere, because that circle is what's going to be the thermostat, and they're going to take like 17% off of what was in that circle. So here we are. An 8-foot circle is the atmosphere. The CO2 suspended by U.S. industry, 0.56 diameter, not even radius. And so that tiny little thing, the size of a buffalo bullet would be what it'd be, that 0.56, and maybe they'd ratchet that down to 0.50, my muzzle loader. And that little thing there, we're going to tiny it down a little bit, and that's the thermostat for the Earth. And so I found myself a lot of different places in this, in the time that I've had the privilege to travel and engage in all of this. One of those things was that I went across Europe, and I was a delegate there for the OSCE. So I'm in the middle of these 57 nation states, and they're being sold this hokey idea from the World Economic Forum, and Klaus Schwab and Larry Fink and George Soros. And I find myself sitting in Angela Merkel's office in the Chancellor's office in Berlin. And she's trying to convince us that we should adopt the German strategy to all of this. And I began to tell her why it was a really crazy idea. They're not used to being rebutted in that fashion. And at a certain point, when I'm making my points along here on the science side, she said, well, I am a physicist and you will not defeat me. And so I knew that was the time to just leave the lady alone at that point. She didn't have much of a sense of humor, but I did kind of part my shot with, here's what we'll do. We'll use American ingenuity, and we'll use German engineering, and we'll take that CO2, we'll compress it down into diamonds, and the good ones we'll give to the ladies, and the cheap ones we'll use for industry. She didn't think that was very funny either. You've got to engage. And I brought people in from around the world to speak on this and to address the science of it. I rejected the science from the beginning. When I arrived in Congress in fall of 2002, they took us aside and said, never debate the science of global warming. You will lose. Just debate the economics, because we Republicans are better with money than Democrats are. And I thought, well, what if I'm right? Why would you back away from a debate if you're right? And here we are today. They have sold this thing to so many people, and you ask them, defend the science of it. They can't do that. But this idea was cooked up years ago at the World Economic Forum by those people I mentioned, Larry Fink, who controls that $10 trillion BlackRock, and then by Klaus Schwab. And I did a deep dive into that starting early in this year. And by the time I came up for air about the middle of May, I wrote an article, just one, that is called The Anatomy of a Boondoggle. And I couldn't figure out the business model of Summit and also of Navigator and the Wolf Project, that's that stub line over there in eastern Iowa. They didn't talk about their business model. They just said how much is going to be paying taxes in the counties and the benefits of $1 a bushel on corn. So I built that whole thing and tracked down into it, took their numbers off their websites, and then I had to go get some known figures to plug in. Here's what they've unleashed. As they put this out, first of all, this scheme, and it is a scheme, they sold it across Europe. And as I talked to those people there, it was clear to me a number of members of the Bundestag didn't believe in it, They'd tell me on the side they don't believe in it, and I would say, okay, why don't you stand up and tell your constituents that it's a hoax? Oh, no, I wouldn't do that. Why not? They'll vote me out of office. That's why. Well, how about I'll stand next to you and I'll tell them? Oh, no, same result. Don't do that. And once you hear that behind the scenes, they're going along with it because the inertia of the politics have taken them to that place. And so it went across Europe and went into the Democrat Party. In this country, Ed Markey was making these arguments on the floor of the House when I arrived, those 22 or so years ago. And he's over in the Senate now doing the same thing. It went from cap and trade to AOC's Green New Deal to the Build Back Better plan, cooked up by the World Economic Forum. And from there to become, they lost on the Build Back Better plan because Joe Manchin had to have a pipeline of all things. And he held out for that, got his pipeline, and then they packed all of this Green New Deal into the Inflation Reduction Act. And once that was signed, it was 16th of August, a year ago last 16th of August, here's now this mother lode of hundreds of billions of dollars. It's been lowballed everywhere across the board on how much money this really is. But when they dump that out there, the folks that are pushing this now, Bruce Rastetter, Summit, Larry Fink, BlackRock, who's pulled back a little bit, and others, they were strategizing on this for years. And I remember Rastetter saying, well, the 45Q is $50 a metric ton. We think it's going to go to $85. About 7 or 8 months later, it went to $85. Who's there encouraging that in the cabinet of Biden? Tom Vilsack. Tom Vilsack, 2-term governor, 3 terms United States Secretary of Agriculture. All he's got to do is say, let's take it to 85. And others said the same thing. So there it sits with that and the 45Z and this huge carrot hanging out in front of these business people. And so in my spreadsheet that I put together to calculate the dollars, I came up with a number. It's this. How many tax dollars be released into this system, whether it be 45Q or 45Z, however that work is behind the scenes between, say, Rastetter and the ethanol plants, how many dollars are triggered if they succeed in the plan that they laid out? That number, annually, $17.6 billion. And a 10-year congressional budget window, you know what that number is. Everybody's got it figured out. $176 billion. And it doesn't stop there. This is spread across the country. We're just the epicenter of it here. And that's the politics of it coming at us. Now, how do we fight this thing? You've heard a number of good ideas, and I didn't hear anything up here that I disagree with. But I start with this. If I'm sitting around a group of people that are going to start a business, maybe I'm expecting to be on the board of directors of a new business model, and they can roll this out and they say, here's what we're going to do. 2,000 miles of pipeline for Summit, and we will secure a part of a duopoly so we can control these ethanol plants and that very valuable CO2 coming out of there, and we'll get the federal government to pay for that by borrowing money from China and then paying off some of the Chinese investors, by the way. You know about that. If I'm sitting at that table, first, it'd be a crazy idea, but the first thing I would say is, if you think you can do this, why don't you explain to me how you're going to comply with the United States Constitution? Altogether, 3,600 miles of pipeline planned, and they told us from the beginning there will be no eminent domain requests. That turned out to be a lie, of course. And we knew it was going to be a lie, and it was a lie when they said it. And but that question is, how are you going to get through this valuable farmland, 5 and 7 generations of families sitting on that, not just sweat dripped into that soil, but blood poured into that soil? I listened to a testimony in Fort Dodge before the Utilities Board, and there was a witness there, and they asked about this land, and he said, this piece of ground over here, 2 different ladies. One lady said, that's that place there that you pointed to on the map, that's where the house was where I met my husband. He's gone now, but I met my husband in there. That piece of ground means something to her. And another witness on a different farm said, this is the farm where my grandmother lost her leg. When you hear things like that, you know this land is more valuable than writing a check for X dollars an acre for an easement that's a one-time payment, and you have to live with that the rest of for the duration of that land. And so when you hear that and you see what's happening with the land, I'll say this. The Constitution says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Real simple. And when that came before the Supreme Court in 2004, decided in 2005, I watched that debate go on and through the Supreme Court. I'm in Congress, of course, at that time. And when the decision came down, a 5-4 split decision that changed the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, you would say de facto changed the meaning of the Fifth Amendment. The way it was written by Justice John Paul Stevens was, nor shall private property be taken for public use or public purpose without just compensation. I went to the floor, we brought a resolution of disapproval and just ripped it into the Supreme Court. I went to the floor and I said, what they've actually done is struck the words from the Fifth Amendment, 3 words, for public use. Now that fact effectively only says, nor shall private property be taken without just compensation. I'd turn your attention to the Alabama Constitution that says there that private property shall not be taken without the consent of the owner. I like that. And then I read a little further after they told me it was in there, and I found that they actually have a provision that allows the legislature to grant it under these circumstances, but by a vote of the legislature by elected people, not appointed, but elected people. In Iowa, we've got appointed people to do that. And so that's the first thing. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution protects our property. I know. Then I lauded Justice O'Connor. That was one decision I really praised her for. She's actually lied in state today at the U.S. Supreme Court building for the mourners to go by, and I would have been there if I was close because she was a gracious lady. But I invited Justice Scalia to my breakfast the following Wednesday morning, and he sat across the table from me, looked me in the eye, and I asked him the question, and he said, Kelo is an erroneous decision, and it will be reversed one day. And that look in his eye told me that he believed that. It was a prophetic statement. And it was also a challenge to me to do my part later on as the chairman of the Constitution Committee in Congress. And so Scalia was right. The decision of Kelo was wrong, but some of the provisions of that don't apply here at all. They don't even get to hide under Kelo because the city of New London, Connecticut had an economic development plan. And then they condemned the property, took it into the possession of the city of Kelo. They had a side deal to hand that property over to a developer who was going to build a Pfizer pharmaceutical factory and a mall and things. That never actually happened. But that was the rationale that let John Paul Stevens say, well, there's a public use component to this that's kind of implicit. You know, there's in the emanations and penumbras of the Constitution, you can find whatever you want to find. If you're not going to be adhering to the text of the Constitution, the original understanding. We've got 6 members of the Supreme Court now. I know some of them want to see this decision come before the Supreme Court. For me, I don't want to race to the Supreme Court with this because I don't want to put all of our eggs in that basket. We lose there, we're cooked. So what we need to do instead is fight every battle, fight every skirmish. If you can't find one, go start one. And start one at every level. Wherever there's a legal place to do a battle, do it. In the district courts, in the counties, all the way through this thing. And if there's people that own land in Iowa and you're from South Dakota, let me know tonight. Sign us up tonight because that lets us have an expedited review. We have to be, it takes a little more than just snapping your fingers, but if we've got landowners from one state who want to sue the adjoining state, that's one of the qualifications for going directly to the Supreme Court. And then in Iowa, we actually have a little stronger provision now in our Iowa Constitution, and it mirrors the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution before they de facto amended it, and all the way down the line. So we have formed the Free Soil Coalition for that purpose, to build this network across the states and to stand up and fight these people. I wanted to put a little bit of levity in this as I get close to wrapping it up here, but I had this thought also. Oh, one more thing. Trent mentioned the King Amendment to the Farm Bill. The last 2 Farm Bills, I brought language. I had to battle to hammer it in the markup in the Ag Committee, and Republican majority in one, I guess, and not in the other. And it's language that says this, that it prohibits it prohibits the states from regulating the method and means of production of agriculture products that are imported from other states. So if California wants to regulate hog production or egg production or ethanol production, they're fine to do that inside the boundaries of California, but they're not fine to tell you folks in South Dakota or we in Iowa or anywhere else how we're going to raise our hogs, how we're going to produce eggs, how we're going to produce ethanol. And so I wrote a bill that does that. It prohibits the states from regulating the method and means of production from another state. Now, that went on in the Farm Bill twice with battle, but it passed the House floor and over to the Senate 5 or 6 years apart, and it got stripped out by the Democrats in the Senate. It's supposedly in that Farm Bill now, or poised to go on that Farm Bill now. If it does, and if that becomes law, the entire argument that California has about regulating the method and means of ethanol, having to regulate our carbon credits on how we're going to produce it here, that whole thing goes away. There's 8 states that are wrapped up with California on this. They sign on to California's lead, and that's what we're looking at. So if we could get that passed in the Farm Bill, if your congressman can just get on that and push that hard, that'd be very good. I'd like to see that. I don't know where he stands on it myself. I just saw somebody smile, so maybe not. But push him anyway. I think it's good to push him. But that's something that could help this. And then, so I want to get to, I want to get just to this little piece of levity that I was thinking about. Maybe first a little piece. I wrote a book. It's over there. It's called Walking Through the Fire: My Fight for the Heart and Soul of America. And what I said when we were out in Neely, Nebraska is I just bought a case of books in. We asked $28 for them. There's a box there and there's books there. And if you want to throw some money in there, it all goes to Free Soil. And so I would appreciate that. But so I'm going to wrap with this. So what is this CO2 that Trent talked about? This CO2 that we exhale and plants breathe. And so I got to thinking about that. I got a little paunchy here a while back, and I thought, I got to have to lose some weight. What's the science in that? So, okay, some comes out, you have different orifices that things come out of, and is that where the weight goes? Well, I looked this up, and I was surprised to find out that about 16% of the weight we lose comes off our body in the form of fluids, whether it's sweat or whatever it might be, spit, tears. I won't add any more. But there's 84% of what weight you lose is in exhaling CO2. So a while back we got to looking at Al Gore, and he was puffed up pretty good. We estimated him at 300 pounds, and he might have been a little more than that at the time. And so then you go look, well, man, about his height, what's his body mass, and what's the overall. Anyway, if we rendered Al Gore down into biodiesel, we wanted to know how much that would be, and so we did the calculations on this, and we figured out at the time that if we rendered him into biodiesel, just the fat, he'd be a nice, lean, slim guy then, get him in good shape, and put that into a nice diesel pickup. We could have driven to Des Moines to Nashville, when I still have a little fuel left over. So there was a use for Al Gore, and we'd have been better off if we'd have rendered him and keep him out of Davos. And so the number one existential threat to the United States of America and Western civilization is the World Economic Forum. We must take them down. We must fight them at every corner. This is one tentacle of the octopus that's strangling free enterprise and strangling freedom. We have to defend our constitutional rights. We have to push our legislatures hard, and this is the time. There's battle now. If we lose in the South Dakota legislature, if we lose in Iowa, we're going to be relying on the Supreme Court alone, and I will fight that all the way. But I don't want to, and I believe if we get it before the court, we will win. But I don't want all my eggs in that basket. Let's beat them before we get there. Thanks you very much. God bless you all.